Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. Greeting fellow YouTubers and welcome to my channel Mindful Samadhi. Firstly, I'd just like to wish you all a happy new year and a year ahead in 2026. It's always good this time of year, or just the time just been anyway, where we can all sort of get together as family and friends and relatives, and generally for most people it's a prolonged period of time where people have that opportunity to get together. So it's good that hopefully most of you have had that opportunity and you can catch up on the year just been, and obviously the year ahead. So it's a very good thing. It's a very good time to re-establish bonds and relationships and all those kinds of things. So I hope it has all been a very good time for you guys. So anyway, moving forward, I've decided to do a video for the new year. This is obviously my first video. We've been quite busy here at the monastery over the past couple of weeks anyway, so I haven't actually gotten around or had the opportunity to do any videos. But I thought today is a better day than any to start. Okay, so today what I want to talk about is the 5 aggregates in Theravada Buddhism. Okay, so more specifically the 5 aggregates of clinging. Okay, so basically this in the Pali language is called Pancha Upadana Khandha. Okay, so more commonly referred to as the Khandhas. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll break that down for you. Okay, so Pancha in Pali means 5. Okay, and Upadana basically could be referred to or labeled as clinging, grasping, or attachment. More commonly it's known as clinging. Okay, Upadana. And then lastly we have Khandhas, which literally translates to aggregate, heap, piles, bundles, or it could even be referred to as groups. Okay, so the question is, what exactly are the 5 aggregates of clinging? So to break it down, I would say that they're the core framework that we can use for analyzing the human experience and this so-called apparent self. Okay, so these aggregates, they break down, and what they do is they describe the psychophysical components that constitute what we perceive as a person or as a human being. Okay, so as mentioned, the term khandha we refer to as heap, aggregate, or bundle. But what I'm going to refer to it as today, its more commonly and popular term will be aggregate. Okay, so the word aggregate in this context is essentially emphasizing that these are simply collections of ever-changing processes that are not actually like a permanent entity. So the important thing to understand here is that this teaching is actually central to the Buddha's doctrine of anatta, which is called non-self in English. And that's showing us that there's actually no unchanging soul or essence behind our experiences. So instead, by us clinging to these aggregates, or me, or mine, is actually what leads to the suffering or the dukkha we experience in this very life. Okay, so it's also important to note that the aggregates I'm about to discuss, sorry, my throat's a bit funny today, are also impermanent, so anicca. They're also unsatisfactory, and they're without an inherent self. So we call this basically anatta, dukkha, anicca. Anicca, anatta, anicca, dukkha, anatta. Okay, so that's the 3. They actually appear exclusively in early texts like the Pali Canon. So, for example, the Khandhas and they're also elaborated not just in Theravada, but both in Mahayana and Theravada traditions. So, not just the Pali Canon does it state this, but it also, it's included in the Mahayana's Heart Sutra, the famous declaration that states that form is emptiness and emptiness is form. So essentially, it applies to all the 5 aggregates, okay? So the Buddha also taught us that, in brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering, linking them directly to the first noble truth, which states life is suffering, or it could even be said life is unsatisfactory, okay? So anyway, I think what it's best I do is I try now to explain the best I can these 5 aggregates, so you all get a better understanding of what I'm going on about, okay? I think that's a better thing to do. So let's get into it, shall we? So first, I think what I'll do is I'll quickly explain the 5 in the original form or wording of Pali, okay? And then what I'll do is I'll give you the English translated words, and then of course after that I'll delve into each one specifically and give more of a detailed explanation, okay? So in Pali, the 5 are basically labelled as follows: Rupa, Vedana, Sanna, Sankhara, and Vinnana, okay? Now to translate these into English words, we would basically have form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and then lastly consciousness, okay? Now, let me now try and break these down the best I can, okay? So number 1 is form. We call this Rupa, okay? So this is the physical or material aspect of our experiences, okay? So the way we experience things through form or Rupa, okay? So it includes the body, for example, being the obvious 5 sense organs. So the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and then the skin, okay? And then we have the external objects that we perceive with these 5 senses, all right? So this would include things like visible forms with our eye consciousness and sight. It would be the sounds that we hear. It would be the smells that we smell through our nose. It would be the tastes that we can taste. And then lastly, the tangible things, which is generally referred to as contact, okay? So these are things that we can class as either palpable, perceptible, or even ponderable, okay? So now, yeah, it's really important to mention, right, that these, in some findings, or actually even in my own personal experience, I found that it can also derive from the 4 great elements as well. So those 4 great elements, or as we refer to as the 4 great elements, are basically earth, so solidity. Then we have water, which we would class as cohesion. Fire, which would be the heat or the warmth and element. And then lastly, the wind. So we would refer to that as the air or the motion element, okay? So to briefly summarize what I've just mentioned, form or Rupa is all matter, and that is perceived through the various senses that I've just mentioned. So now what we must understand is that Rupa is not just matter, okay? But it's also the basis for all our sensory contact and also the stimuli. So knowing this, we can then get a better understanding of anicca, that it is all impermanent, okay? And what we should know is that this body of ours, it ages, so it decays and it changes constantly from moment to moment. So therefore, clinging to form, so for example, having an attachment to the physical appearance or health, what it will do is it eventually will create suffering for us. And that is what we refer to as Rupa or form, okay? Hopefully that makes a bit of sense. All right, so secondly, what we have is vedana. We call this feeling, okay? It sounds pretty straightforward and relatively easy to understand, pretty straightforward English word, but there is quite a bit of depth to it in a Buddhist context, okay? So what this does is actually refers to the basic pleasure or happiness that the human experiences. So, or even to put it better, it's like the base emotional tone that we experience when we either like or when we dislike something, okay? So be it a pleasant, an unpleasant, or a neutral feeling. So it arises when a sensory organ makes contact with an object. So that's generally coupled together with consciousness. So for example, a pleasant taste or a painful touch. That's probably a good way, to give you a brief explanation. It would be like, pleasant taste or a painful touch. Where they're obvious feelings that arises, and we're more than aware of those, okay? So now we need to understand that vedana is not just full-blown emotion, but it's more a raw affective quality that conditions and feelings like us liking something or having aversion or even like a form of indifference. So understanding that unmindful attachment to pleasant sensations generally will fuel craving, while aversion or anger to unpleasant ones will perpetuate suffering. Okay, so here's a quick rundown of the three types of vedana or feelings, just so you can get a better understanding, and I can go into a bit more depth with it. Okay, so the first one we have is pleasant feelings. So obviously this would be an agreeable feeling for most, like a euphoric or a pleasant experience, something positive or something that makes us happy, butterfly feelings we could call it. There's many different versions of a pleasant feeling, all right? But what we need to observe and caution ourselves with here is this can quickly lead to attachment if it's not observed mindfully. So we have to be very careful in that area, okay? Secondly, we have the unpleasant feelings, which are generally going to be disagreeable, obviously, and inevitably they're going to lead us to suffering. And then thirdly, we have neutral, okay? Now, this we can describe as neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and this can often lead to a thing called avidya, which is ignorance. So as you can see, those three vedana or feelings that we have actually differ from the full emotions that we can experience. As full emotions tend to involve things like perception and mental formations. So vedana is the bare feeling that one feels within their practice, okay? So it's essential that we get a proper understanding that feelings are simply fleeting and they're conditioned. Once we understand the impermanence of feelings and knowing that everything is temporary and subject to change, we can then evolve rapidly in our meditation practice. For example, when a pain, like a feeling or sensation arises in your practice, you can now shift your awareness mindfully to the specific area. You can label it, you can note it mindfully, and then you can shift your awareness back to your primary meditation object. I will cover this a bit more when we get to sanna, perception. But that is basically what we can do if we want to put it into a practical sense with our meditation. So more times than not, you'll find that pain or the sensation that you're having or feeling, it will eventually subside, more times than not quite rapidly. So this is my best way to explain vedana or feelings, okay? Now the third one we have is what I just briefly went over with the labeling and noting method, which is sanna, which we call perception, okay? Now, perception is actually an integral part of our meditation practice. What this actually refers to is as us having an understanding and then us also being able to comprehend the mental processes by recognizing and identifying and then even labeling sensory experiences based on their distinguishing characteristics. Okay, so what I mean here, it sounds all a bit confusing, doesn't it? What I mean here is when our sensory perceptions pick up various things, like sounds and sight and touch and so on. What we want to be doing is grasping or labeling their distinguishing features or qualities. So for example, let's use an apple. So if you see an apple, you note the apple, and then you perceive the color of the apple. You then observe the size of the apple, and then you'd look at the context and the shape of the apple. Okay, so you're kind of decompressing its qualities or its properties, so to speak. And what this does is it actually enables our memory, what it does is it categorizes it for potential future reference. So another example would be, if you were doing walking meditation and you see a car drive past, for example, you could label it as a car, white, noisy, and then revert back to your original primary object of meditation. Be that anapanasati, if you're contemplating the breath, or the rising and falling of the abdomen, or if it's perhaps an object or whatever your primary object may be, you just revert back to that. So anything that arises within our practice, be it a car driving past, or if we see a flower or a rose, or if we hear something like a dog barking, we can deconstruct that sensory thing that we've established. Like if it's a sound, like a dog barking, we can go, okay, dog barking, sound, noise, and things like this. We can deconstruct and look at the properties of it. That's a bit of a computer term, but you can look at the properties and then note it and label it, and then revert back to your primary object and continue on with your practice. So doing this noting of various objects, what it does is it marks it out for future recall or future recollection, okay? So it accompanies every moment of consciousness. So perception, it can actually be wholesome or unwholesome. And we can use this in our vipassana or insight meditation practice, okay? So we do this by understanding the perception of impermanence, the perception of non-self, the perception of unattractiveness, and also the perception of death. And obviously the list goes on and on, but I won't continue going on, but I think you get the general gist. So I think there's up to 10 perceptions listed in some suttas, like the Girimahanda Sutta. Girimahanda Sutta, I think it is, yeah. There's like 10 perceptions listed in that one. So to sum it up from a meditative standpoint, we can look at perception being illusionary or even distorted for that matter. So in Vipassana meditation, we can see the arising and passing of the aggregates, which in turn, it reveals to us the unreliability of these material objects that we're actually perceiving, okay? So ultimately, having the correct perception through our practice is what leads us to wisdom or panya, which lets us see reality as it really is. So generally we'll find, when you look into this and find this wisdom or this panya arise within oneself, you will find that it's interdependent, you'll find it's empty, and you'll find it's also illusionary. So, even, with its apparent shape and its solidity, it's not really, it's empty and it's an illusionary thing. Even though we perceive it through our eye consciousness as being a material object, an external object, and a solid form to it, you will find with your practice, if you're doing it correctly, that it's generally empty and it's an illusionary thing based from our eye consciousness. It's forming this perception. It sounds very confusing, but if you look into this 5 aggregates of clinging in depth, you will understand what I'm talking about here. It's quite a detailed and intricate topic. It's not an easy thing to understand. It personally took me quite a while to grasp the context of all this. But essentially, when you start doing the practice, or if you're a practitioner, you will understand where I'm coming from here. And this important insight, once properly understood, it actually liberates us from suffering by ending all this clinging and this attachment that we can essentially have, you know. So you'll find this is generally, you know, it's generally fueled by our mistaken perceptions of things we perceive through these sense doors, you know, through our eyes and ears and nose and our taste and all these sense doors. We create a perception, and that is where we actually get mistaken, okay? So that is basically perception, okay? So the next one we're going to move on to is mental formations. So we refer to this in Pali as sankhara, okay? So firstly, we need to understand the meaning of the word in English, obviously, before we can go any further. So sankhara literally means to put together, be constructed or conditioned, if that makes sense. So this broad category includes things like volitions, intentions, habits, emotions, and all other mental factors, except for feelings and perception, okay? So in the Abhidharma systems, it encompasses 51 or so specific factors like attention, effort, greed, hatred, mindfulness, and so on. So it covers the significant actions and thoughts, words and deeds that shape our future experiences. So mental formations ultimately drive our behavior, and it therefore creates karmic imprints within us, which can be an attribute to the cycle of rebirth as well. So it's things like contact, effort, greed, hatred, and attention that can shape our responses to situations and experiences. Okay, so therefore bringing with it wholesome, unwholesome, and neutral formations, which in turn is what generates karma. Okay, so essentially we need to understand that all conditions and causes are impermanent and they're unsatisfactory. Okay, so anicca and dukkha. All right, so in Buddhism, we call this either sabbe sankhara anicca, which means all conditioned things are impermanent, or we call it sabbe sankhara dukkha. So that means all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. Or obviously we could refer to dukkha as suffering, but in this context we would say all conditioned things are unsatisfactory. All right. So again, from a meditative standpoint, we can reveal that sankhara or mental formations are all impermanent, they're all unsatisfactory, and they're all non-self, anatta. Okay, so stopping new formations will eventually lead us to nibbana, which is the unconditioned, okay? Now, this is easier said than done, but it can be achieved with proper understanding and panya, or wisdom, okay? So lastly, that's pretty much covered that one, sankhara. So lastly, what I'll cover now is the fifth and last one, which is consciousness, okay? And we call this in Pali vinnana, okay? So this is the basic awareness or cognition that arises, which is dependent on the sense organ and object, okay? So for example, hopefully you guys are staying with me here. For example, our eye consciousness, right, for sight, the mind consciousness is for thoughts, the ear consciousness is for hearing, and so on and so forth. So all in all, there's 6 different types that correspond to the senses, including the mind as the 6th. Okay, so consciousness is not a permanent observer, so to speak, but instead a momentary dependent process. So it knows, so to speak, but it has no independent existence, if that makes sense. It basically describes the conditioned, ever-changing processes that put together what we mistakenly take to be the so-called permanent self. Okay, so you could say that it roughly translates as consciousness, discernment, or awareness. But it can also refer specifically to the bare cognition or actual knowing of an object through one of our 6 sense doors. So in Buddhism, we see these 6 sense doors as all forms of consciousness. So the eyes, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, we class as all varying forms of consciousness. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and the reason we call this is because there's a proximate cause for each one of these. So when we have our eye consciousness, for example, we see something like an object, okay? And then that creates a perception. So this can create many different varying factors like emotions, it can create attachment, it can create delusion, it can create clinging, it can create many problems just from looking at something, and then this is perceiving something. So this therefore is creating some form of consciousness. So all 6 of these, in Buddhism we class as consciousness, okay? So each moment of each one of these consciousnesses are actually momentary, okay? So they're not permanent, they're transient, they're fleeting. So they're essentially arising and ceasing almost instantaneously. They're all conditioned by their own form or contact. So we can now understand, I think, and we can also comprehend more easily that vinnana, or consciousness, does not actually exist independently. It actually requires a sense base followed by an object, okay? So that's what I was just mentioning with the eyes. We see, but then when we see an object, then the sanna, the perception, falls into place, you see. I hope you're following. So the Buddha once said, apart from condition, there is no arising of consciousness, okay? So this is coming from the Buddha's mouth. Again, I'll repeat, apart from condition, so apart from a condition, there is no any arising of a consciousness. So if you put some thought into that and you remove the 6 sense bases, I think you get the picture. It sounds a bit full on, but that is how it is, okay? So you will understand this if you're doing practice and you're a meditative practitioner. This will all come to the surface and you'll have this awareness. So you see, like all the aggregates, vinnana is no different in the sense that it's impermanent, it's unsatisfactory, and it's literally empty of its inherent self. So it's the clinging to consciousness as me or mine, that is what is actually creating the suffering within us, okay? So it's an important thing to understand about each one of these aggregates. And the way we can do this is by practicing vipassana meditation. And then one will eventually see that each aggregate essentially arises and it passes. And we can then understand its empty, conditioned nature. So basically, to summarize everything I've just mentioned, is these 5 aggregates together, we can now have the understanding that each aggregate is interdependent and they arise together in every moment of our life. So for example, again, another example, I'm trying to explain this the best I can, so I think elaborating with examples I'm finding is probably a better way to make more sense for you guys, you know, so that's why I'm coming up with these varying examples. I think it's more effective the way if I use examples. So, for example, the contact with a sense object, okay, so when we make contact with a sense object or a form, what that then does is it produces the feeling, all right? And then it's our perception that is what labels it, okay? So once we see something, you know, if we see an object, that then object will create a feeling. It could be an emotional feeling, but it creates some form of feeling, all right? And then what we need to do is utilize our perception and then label it, okay? And then after that, the mental formation, it will respond. So for example, craving or aversion, okay? It will then react. It will have like a reactive response. So it could be hatred, aversion, or it could be lust or love, or it could be any one of these things. And then lastly, it's the consciousness that is what cognizes this whole process and brings it together, creating this 5 aggregates of clinging. So you could almost think of it as forming a dynamic like washing machine, okay, of arising and ceasing phenomena, which has no actual fixed controller whatsoever. So these 5 aggregates are all wishing and washing together and creating this clinging, okay? So this connection to the core teachings of impermanence or anicca is that all aggregates constantly are changing and they have literally no stability whatsoever. So suffering or dukkha, this is the clinging to them as permanent or self, which is generally what causes the pain as they, essentially, inevitably they will dissolve. We call this upadana in Pali, okay? And then there is the non-self or anatta. So none of the aggregates, either be it individually or even combined together, is a soul, okay? It's not the soul or anything. So trying to search for a soul in them, it will only yield empty processes or empty results. Insight into this, what it actually does is it liberates us from the ego illusion, all right? So in meditation, for example, vipassana or mindfulness of the 4 foundations or 4 foundations of mindfulness, what happens is practitioners observe the aggregates and their arising and passing nature, and what this does is it will essentially develop detachment for us, okay? And this is very vital in our practice. So in Theravada Buddhism, we emphasize that the aggregates, we emphasize them as like burdens to be understood for liberation, for our own sake. So this is more detailed and explained in the Abhidharma. So you can find more detail and depth to it if you look into the Abhidharma. Okay, so understanding the 5 aggregates, what it does is it deconstructs the illusion of a solid self. And it opens up and reveals this experience as like a fluid-like conditioned flow state, okay? So it's ever-changing, transient, that's why I gave the example of the washing machine kind of experience, So simply having this insight, it reduces clinging. It adds to, things like karuna, compassion, and then eventually it leads towards nibbana, which is essentially the freedom from suffering, okay? So hopefully I've done a relatively and reasonable job explaining this. It's a very tricky, I refer to these as Buddha's formulas, but this one in particular, the 5 aggregates of clinging, it can be relatively quite a in-depth topic to discuss and explain. I've tried to sort of do it the best I could, primarily to give you guys the most simplistic example of it. You can go into a lot more advanced depth in this subject, but today I thought I'd just briefly brush over the topic so you generally understand the consensus, especially when it comes to our meditation practice as well, because these 5 aggregates of clinging plays a vital and a very integral part of our meditation, okay? So understanding these is super, super important. So that's all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe, do all those things, and I will more than likely put up another video in the next few days. However, if I don't endeavor to do so, I will do another video next week for you guys, okay? So that's all for today. Te Rawan Sanai, and I hope you all have a lovely afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week, okay? Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.